What if I told you that one of the most dominant stretches in NASCAR history wasn't just built on skill, determination, or even superior engineering? What if it was built on something you can buy at any hardware store for $3? We're talking about wax. Common, everyday, nothing special paraffin wax. And the man who figured out how to use it didn't have a computer, a PhD, or even a fancy engineering degree. He had a workbench, a sharp mind, and the audacity to try something so simple it almost sounds like a joke. But it wasn't a joke. It won races. And when the people in charge finally figured out what was happening, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the hidden engineering tricks, backroom innovations, and rule-bending schemes that shaped professional racing. If you're someone who loves the real stories behind motorsport, the ones they don't put in the press releases or the official histories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the wax itself, I need you to understand something about NASCAR in the early 1980s. Because without that context, the story doesn't hit nearly as hard. This was an era where the rulebook was more of a suggestion than a law. Teams ran acid-dipped body panels to shave weight. Fuel additives bordered on aviation-grade rocket propellant. Hydraulic suspension systems could literally lower a car during a race to improve aerodynamics. It was the Wild West of American motorsport, and the attitude was simple. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. That culture is essential to understanding what happened next, because what Maurice Petty did wasn't born in a vacuum. It was born in a garage full of guys who saw rules as puzzles to be solved rather than lines to stay inside of. Now, here's the thing about Maurice Petty. Most people know his brother Richard, the king himself, the 7-time champion with 200 career victories and a smile that became as famous as his number 43 STP Pontiac. But Maurice? Maurice was the quiet one, the engine builder, the man behind the curtain. While Richard was signing autographs and waving to the crowd, Maurice was back in Level Cross, North Carolina, doing math that nobody else was doing and asking questions nobody else thought to ask. And one of those questions changed everything. The question was this: what if an engine could pass a legal inspection at 358 cubic inches, which was the strict maximum NASCAR allowed at the time, and then somehow become bigger during the race? Now, you might be thinking that sounds physically impossible. You can't just make an engine grow. Metal doesn't expand that dramatically. The cylinders are what they are. And you'd be right if you were only thinking about metal. But Maurice wasn't thinking about metal. He was thinking about wax. Here's what most people don't realize about how NASCAR inspections worked in 1983. Inspectors checked engine displacement using a pump system. They'd rotate the crankshaft to bottom dead center, inject fluid into each cylinder, and measure the exact volume. Add all 8 cylinders together and you get your total displacement. Simple, accurate, effective. But here's the critical detail that Maurice Petty saw and nobody else did. The inspection happened with a cold engine. Room temperature, maybe 65 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, once you passed, the assumption was that your engine stayed legal for the rest of the event. Nobody checked again. At least not routinely. That gap, that window between cold inspection and hot racing, was where Maurice went to work. Paraffin wax melts at around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. A NASCAR engine running at full race pace generates coolant temperatures around 200 degrees and combustion chamber temperatures that climb far beyond that. So if you carefully pressed measured amounts of wax into the combustion chambers before inspection, the wax would take up space, artificially reducing the measured displacement. The engine checks in at 358. Legal, clean, no flags. But the moment that engine fires up and starts building heat, the clock starts ticking. Lap after lap, the temperature climbs. And somewhere around lap 10 to lap 15, the wax doesn't just soften. It liquefies completely. It gets atomized by combustion and blown out through the exhaust system in microscopic droplets that leave virtually no trace. And suddenly, Richard Petty is driving a 373 cubic inch engine, while every other car on the track is stuck at 358. 15 cubic inches of pure, invisible advantage, appearing from nowhere, leaving no evidence, gone before the checkered flag. The general rule of thumb in motorsport is that every cubic inch of displacement is worth roughly 2 horsepower at peak output. Do that math and you're looking at a 25 to 30 horsepower advantage. In a sport where entire seasons are decided by margins measured in fractions of a second, that's not a small edge. That's a chasm. That's the difference between chasing the leader and lapping the field. Think of it this way. Imagine you're running a foot race against someone, and you've both agreed to wear identical shoes. But your competitor has somehow figured out how to swap their shoes mid-race for ones with springs in the soles. And by the time anyone thinks to check, the springs have dissolved. That's what was happening at racetracks across America in the early 1980s. Richard Petty would pull away on the straights with a kind of authority that the other drivers simply couldn't explain. They'd test their own engines on the dynamometer and see comparable power numbers. They'd examine their setups and find nothing wrong. But on track, especially after 50 or 100 miles, the 43 car would just walk away from the field like it had found an extra gear that everyone else was missing. Junior Johnson, himself a legendary figure in the history of creative rule interpretation, admitted years later that he knew something was going on. He said that the Petty motor would come alive around lap 20 and that his crew had torn their own engines apart looking for what the Pettys had found. They never found it because they were looking for a mechanical solution to what was actually a chemical one. The preparation that went into making this work was extraordinary. Maurice couldn't just dump random amounts of wax into a cylinder and hope for the best. He had to calculate precise volumes for each individual combustion chamber, accounting for the shape of the chamber, the valve pockets, the spark plug location, and the compression ratio. Too much wax and the engine fails inspection. Too little and you leave power on the table. The margin for error was essentially zero. The type of wax mattered enormously. Standard candle wax would leave residue that could foul spark plugs, contaminate oil, or damage valve seat. Maurice needed something that would melt cleanly and completely, burning off without a trace. After what had to have been extensive secret testing, they settled on a specific grade of paraffin with a melting point that was low enough to liquefy quickly during race conditions but high enough to remain solid and stable throughout the pre-race inspection process. Getting that specification exactly right was itself an engineering achievement. Installing the wax was described by people familiar with the process as an art form. You'd warm it just enough to make it pliable, press it carefully into the combustion chambers so that it conformed perfectly to every surface without trapping air pockets, and then let it cool and harden before the engine was assembled. The whole process added hours to engine preparation. But when the payoff is 25 extra horsepower that appears out of thin air and vanishes before anyone can catch it, those hours were well spent. This is where it gets really interesting. Maurice didn't just throw wax in and call it a day. He had to engineer the rest of the motor around this trick. A bigger effective displacement changes everything. It changes your air and fuel requirements. It changes your ignition timing. It changes how your exhaust system scavenges spent gases. The camshaft profile that works perfectly for 358 cubic inches might be completely wrong for 373. So what Maurice built was essentially a transformer engine, one that ran adequately at 358 cubic inches during inspection and qualifying, and then transformed into something genuinely special once the wax melted away and the full displacement came online. The camshaft was ground with a profile that would really sing at 373 cubic inches. The carburetor was jetted rich enough to feed the bigger displacement once it emerged. The headers and exhaust pipes were tuned for the larger motor, which meant the engine was actually giving up some performance during the early lap. But once everything came online, once the wax was gone and the displacement jumped, all of those components worked in perfect harmony. It was like a symphony where the conductor knows that some instruments don't join until the third movement. Everything was designed around that moment when the engine became what it was always meant to be. They built a private dynamometer cell at the Petty shop specifically for testing these engines. They'd run simulated race cycles for hours, watching the power curve shift in real time. At startup, roughly 620 horsepower. After 5 minutes of running, 635. After 10 minutes, 645. Once all the wax was gone, a steady 650 horsepower. That 30 horsepower gain wasn't just about peak numbers either. The extra displacement fattened up the entire torque curve, making the engine pull harder coming out of corners and carry speed more effectively through traffic. Richard could drive the car differently than his competitors. He could use lines that only worked with that extra grunt underneath him. Now, before we talk about how this all came crashing down, I want to pause on something that often gets overlooked in this story. The sheer audacity of what they were attempting. Think about who we're talking about. This wasn't some backmarker team with nothing to lose. This was Petty Enterprises, the most storied team in NASCAR history. Richard Petty was the face of the sport, a 7-time champion, a cultural icon who was as close to royalty as American motorsport had ever produced. If this scheme was discovered, the fallout wouldn't just be a fine or a points penalty. It would be a scandal that could taint an entire legacy. And yet Maurice pressed wax into those cylinders anyway. That tells you everything you need to know about the competitive culture inside that garage. Winning wasn't just important. It was the only thing that mattered. The 1983 season opened with promise. Richmond Fairgrounds Raceway, February 20th. The Miller High Life 500. Richard Petty in the famous number 43 STP Pontiac, leading 207 of 400 laps and pulling away from the field in exactly the kind of dominant fashion that made other crew chiefs pull their hair out. He took the win, his 198th career victory, and the crowd erupted. Victory Lane was a celebration. The wax was already gone, vaporized somewhere around lap 12, leaving nothing behind but extra horsepower and a clean engine that measured exactly 358 cubic inches if anyone cared to check. Nobody checked. The post-race inspection was routine. Weight, height, body template. Standard stuff. The engine sat untouched. Another perfect execution of Morris's melting miracle. But here's where the story turns. And this is the part that gets me every single time I think about it. The wax trick wasn't what got them caught. What got them caught was a tire. A left side tire that looked just a hair too big. Just a fraction outside of what was supposed to be on that car. Dick Beattie, NASCAR's technical director at the time, was one of those officials with the kind of eye that notices things most people walk right past. He'd been watching the 43 car carefully for some time, and something about those left side tires didn't sit right. By NASCAR's own accounting, the infraction was relatively minor, worth perhaps 1/10 of a second per lap. Practically nothing. But it gave Beattie and his team the justification they needed to dig deeper. The inspection that followed was unlike anything NASCAR had conducted to that point. They didn't just measure the exterior of the car. They disassembled the engine. Piece by piece, component by component. Bore, stroke, rod length, compression height. Every measurement recorded, every number compared to what the rulebook said it should be. And when they put it all together, the displacement came back at 373 cubic inches. Not 358. Not close to 358. A full 15 cubic inches over the legal limit. An engine that had passed pre-race inspection just 48 hours earlier at a legal 358 was now measuring 373 in post-race teardown. The math didn't add up. Nothing added up. Maurice tried to explain it away. Measurement errors. Race damage. Carbon buildup affecting chamber volumes. He was smooth about it. calm and matter-of-fact in the way that only someone who has rehearsed their cover story truly can be. But NASCAR kept digging. They put a borescope inside the combustion chambers and started looking at the walls, the valve pockets, the surfaces that a running engine touches hundreds of times per second. And in the pockets of a couple of valves they found it. Tiny. Microscopic. But there. Traces of wax residue that hadn't quite made it out through the exhaust. A few droplets of paraffin changed everything. Bill France Jr. flew down personally to deal with the situation. This wasn't something you delegated. The Petties were NASCAR royalty, and you couldn't handle royalty with a form letter and a phone call. What followed were conversations that, by all accounts, were tense and direct. France understood the culture. He knew that teams pushed rules. He knew that creative engineering was part of the sport's DNA. But this was different. This was systematic, deliberate, and sophisticated enough to suggest it had been happening for a long time. The penalties came down. A $35,000 fine for petty enterprises, which in 2024 dollars represents something close to $105,000. Richard lost 104 championship points, though he was allowed to keep the win because NASCAR's rulebook at the time was murkier on that specific point than France would have liked. Maurice was suspended from crew chief duties for the remainder of the Richmond event and the subsequent race at Rockingham. By the standards of today's NASCAR, where penalties can strip entire seasons of points and ban personnel for years, it might sound light. But in 1983, it was a thunderclap. The message was heard loud and clear throughout every garage in the sport. More importantly, and this is the lasting consequence that defines the true impact of the wax trick, NASCAR fundamentally changed how it conducted technical inspections. Random post-race displacement checks became standard procedure. Engines would now be measured at operating temperature as well as cold. A paper trail was required for every measurement taken at every event. More officials were hired and trained specifically for engine inspection. The window of opportunity that Maurice Petty had exploited so brilliantly was closed, locked, and the key was thrown away. The reaction from around the motorsport world was fascinating. Some people were outraged. Here was the most famous team in the sport's history cheating in a premeditated, calculated, sophisticated way. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a gray area. It was a deliberate attempt to circumvent the rules that every other team was playing by. That felt like a betrayal to a lot of fans who had built their love of the sport around Richard Petty's heroic, honest image. But others, particularly the engineers and mechanics and crew chiefs who understood what Maurice had actually done, reacted differently. Smokey Yunick, the legendary mechanic whose own reputation for creative rule bending was encyclopedic, called it brilliant. He said he'd thought of something similar himself but assumed NASCAR would catch on immediately. He said Maurice had something he lacked, and that thing was nerve. Junior Johnson, once he finally understood what had been done, reportedly nodded slowly and said nothing for a long moment. That silence said more than words could. Other teams immediately started experimenting with variations on the concept. If wax worked, what about dry ice? What about materials with different melting points? What about compounds that could expand rather than contract with heat? The cat-and-mouse game that defines the relationship between racing teams and sanctioning bodies accelerated dramatically. Teams got creative. NASCAR got more sophisticated. And the sport emerged from the episode fundamentally different from how it had entered. Now, let's talk about the technical side of why this worked so effectively, because I think this is where the real genius lives. The physics of what Maurice accomplished are actually more elegant than they first appear. Displacement is calculated by measuring bore and stroke, the cylinder's diameter and the piston's travel distance, and multiplying by the number of cylinders. A standard NASCAR engine of that era ran a bore of approximately 4.185 inches and a stroke of 3.25 inches across 8 cylinders, producing 358 cubic inches. Simple math. Hard limit. But what Maurice understood was that displacement, as measured by the pump method NASCAR used during inspections, is really just a measurement of volume. And volume can be manipulated by anything that occupies space, including wax. When the wax filled portions of the combustion chambers, it physically reduced the volume that the measurement pump could detect. The bore and stroke hadn't changed. The pistons, rods, and crankshaft were exactly what they were supposed to be. But the effective volume above the piston at top dead center was smaller because the wax was sitting there, occupying space, pretending to be engine metal. The inspector's pump couldn't tell the difference between combustion chamber wall and wax. It just measured what was there. Once the wax melted and evacuated, that volume was restored. The space above the piston opened up. More air and fuel could be inducted per cycle. Each combustion event released more energy. The engine breathed deeper, pulled harder, and delivered more power to the rear wheels. It was, in the most literal sense, an engine that grew during the race. The thermodynamics had an additional benefit that Maurice may or may not have anticipated. During the warm-up phase, before the wax fully melted, it would act as a temporary insulator inside the combustion chambers. This actually helped the engine reach operating temperature faster and more evenly than it otherwise might. As the wax transitioned from solid to liquid, it would briefly enrich the combustion mixture, since the paraffin itself contains significant hydrocarbon content. Think of it as a tiny, timed fuel injection event built into the engine's chemistry. Every wax molecule that burned contributed energy. Nothing was wasted. Here's what most people don't realize when they look back at this story. The wax trick didn't exist in isolation. It was one piece of a much larger engineering philosophy at Petty Enterprises, one that viewed every component of a race car as a variable rather than a constant. While the wax was handling displacement, other innovations were working on aerodynamics, fuel delivery, suspension geometry, and tire behavior. The wax was hidden inside all of that activity, camouflaged by a dozen other things that NASCAR officials were already watching for. It was like a magician using misdirection. While everyone was looking at one hand, the other hand was doing something entirely different. This is where the competitive intelligence aspect gets genuinely interesting. The Petties weren't just trying to cheat. They were managing information. They knew that if their car was dramatically faster than everyone else's, questions would be asked. So they engineered performance advantages across multiple systems, each one providing a small, explainable gain that wouldn't trigger deep scrutiny on its own. The left side tires that ultimately drew attention? Those provided a handling advantage that made the car more consistent, which helped Richard preserve tires and maintain pace later in races. The fuel additives they experimented with helped combustion efficiency. The chassis geometry they ran was optimized in ways that most competitors hadn't explored yet. Any one of these things, standing alone, looked like smart engineering. Together, they created a package that was nearly unbeatable. The wax was the crown jewel, the hidden ace, the thing that, if everything else was roughly equal, ensured that the 43 car could dig deep in the final 100 miles and find something that nobody else had. Let's take a moment to consider the human element here, because I think we sometimes reduce these stories to pure technical analysis and forget that real people were carrying enormous psychological weight. Imagine being the crew member whose job it was to install the wax before every race. The pressure of getting every measurement exactly right, of knowing that a slightly generous hand in one cylinder could end your season before it started, of understanding that your work might come under intense scrutiny from people specifically trained to find exactly what you were hiding. You'd be carrying that all week. You'd be carrying it through qualifying, through practice, through the pre-race inspection. And then, when the car disappeared into the first turn and the engine started climbing toward operating temperature, you'd be waiting, counting laps in your head, knowing that somewhere around lap 12 or 15, the secret would be gone and you could finally breathe again. That's a particular kind of pressure. And the fact that it was maintained, apparently across multiple seasons and multiple events, speaks to the discipline and commitment that defined Petty Enterprises at its peak. Richard Petty's own role in all of this is one of the great unanswered questions. He maintained publicly and consistently that he simply drove what Maurice built and didn't involve himself in the technical details. And look, there's something to that. Drivers in that era often had a deliberate ignorance of certain mechanical particulars, particularly ones that fell into legally ambiguous territory. What you don't know, you can't accidentally reveal under questioning. But here's the thing. Drivers in 1983 were intimately connected to their machines in a way that modern drivers sometimes aren't. They felt every vibration, heard every change in exhaust note, noticed every shift in the car's behavior. And an engine that was progressively gaining power over the first 15 laps of a race would produce a very specific and noticeable change in feel. The accelerator would become more responsive. The straightaway speed would build. The car would begin to feel increasingly alive beneath you. If Richard Petty drove those races and felt none of that, he had the least sensitive seat in the history of professional motorsport. The far more likely interpretation is that he knew exactly what was happening and understood that plausible deniability was part of the deal. He was the face. Maurice was the brain. And some things were better left unspoken between brothers. What's undeniable is that Richard's driving ability was entirely real, regardless of what was under the hood. 7 championships don't happen through engineering alone. The man could wheel a race car with a precision and intelligence that few drivers in history have matched. But the wax gave that talent an amplifier. It took a great driver and put him in a car that could win even when circumstances weren't ideal. Now, some people look at the $35,000 fine and the 104 points penalty and argue that NASCAR went easy on the Pettys because of who they were. And there's probably some truth to that. The politics of sanctioned racing are never truly separate from its personalities. Richard Petty was the sport's greatest ambassador at a time when NASCAR was still fighting for mainstream legitimacy. You don't alienate your biggest star over a cylinder full of wax if you can avoid it. The penalties were designed to be firm enough to deter repetition and signal seriousness, but not so devastating that they destroyed a franchise essential to the sport's growth. But here's the counterargument, and I think it's worth making clearly. The changes to NASCAR's inspection protocol that came out of this incident were not gentle or symbolic. They were structural and permanent. Random post-race engine checks, hot displacement testing, sealed engines between sessions, expanded inspector training and staffing. These reforms cost money and added complexity to every race weekend. They were not the actions of a sanctioning body that was going easy on anyone. They were the actions of an organization that had just realized how badly it had been exposed, and was determined to make sure it never happened again. The fine and points might have been politically moderated. The rule changes were not. Junior Johnson, in discussing the incident years later, made an observation that I find genuinely profound. He said that what Maurice did wasn't just about cheating. It was about seeing the rule from a different angle than anyone else. He said that most people read a rule and figure out how to comply with it. Maurice read a rule and figured out what it was actually measuring, and then found a way to satisfy the measurement without satisfying the spirit. That distinction between the letter of a rule and its measurement mechanism is where all great technical innovation in motorsport lives. It's the same thinking that produced ground effect aerodynamics in Formula One, the same thinking behind double diffusers and flexible wings and mass dampers. Find what's actually being measured. Then optimize for the measurement rather than the intent. The wax trick was the blue-collar American version of that same intellectual process. No supercomputers. No computational fluid dynamic. No team of PhD engineers. Just one guy in a machine shop, looking at a paraffin candle and asking himself a very specific question. This is also where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. The 1983 incident sits at a genuine inflection point in NASCAR's development as a sport. The years before it were defined by individual creativity and garage ingenuity. The years after it were increasingly defined by standardization, corporate involvement, and institutional oversight. The wax trick is almost a perfect dividing line between two eras of American racing. Before the wax, NASCAR was a sport where a smart mechanic with a good idea could change the competitive order. After the wax, that world began its slow fade toward the heavily regulated, deeply structured modern series we watch today. Some people mourn that transition. They'll tell you that what NASCAR lost in the years after 1983 was the soul of what made it great. The creativity, the improvisation, the sense that any given Sunday could be upended by something nobody had thought of yet. And there's genuine sadness in that perspective. The romance of the Wild West garage era was real and it was worth preserving. But others point out that the professionalization of NASCAR's technical oversight is exactly what allowed the sport to grow into a billion-dollar enterprise with genuine mainstream credibility. That the stories that make us nostalgic for the wax trick era are also stories of fundamental unfairness, where teams with more creative cheaters beat teams with better legitimate engineering. The playing field that emerged from stricter enforcement was more level, even if it was less romantic. Both things are true simultaneously. The wax trick was beautiful and it was wrong. And sports that last long enough eventually have to choose order over beauty, even when order is less interesting. Let's dig into something that rarely gets discussed when people tell this story, which is the broader ecosystem of technical creativity that surrounded the wax trick. Because Maurice Petty didn't develop this approach in isolation. He was working in a culture that had been developing and refining technical deception for decades, and understanding that culture is essential to understanding why this particular trick was possible and why it worked for as long as it apparently did. NASCAR's roots are famously tied to moonshine runners, men who modified their vehicles for performance not as a hobby but as a survival strategy. Speed wasn't just exciting. It was the difference between freedom and a federal conviction. That mentality, the idea that mechanical ingenuity in the service of winning was both legitimate and admirable regardless of what the rules said, became hardwired into stock car racing's culture from its earliest days. The first NASCAR inspectors were dealing with cars that had hidden fuel tanks, weighted roll cages, and body panels made of materials that were definitely not what the rulebook specified. Cheating in NASCAR wasn't a corruption of the sport's values. In a twisted way, it was an expression of them. By the time we reach 1983, the techniques had become dramatically more sophisticated. Teams were using wind tunnels, though access was limited and expensive. Computer modeling was beginning to appear, though it was primitive by modern standards. But the core philosophy remained unchanged from the moonshine era. Find an advantage. Hide it. Keep winning until someone figures it out. Then find the next advantage. What Maurice did with the wax was sit at the pinnacle of this evolutionary process. He found an advantage that was genuinely invisible, not just hard to detect but physically self-erasing. The evidence didn't need to be hidden or destroyed after the fact because it destroyed itself as a natural consequence of how it worked. From a purely technical standpoint, that's a more elegant solution than anything else being done in NASCAR garages at the time. The acid-dipped body panels could be found if you weighed them carefully enough. The illegal fuel additives left chemical signatures. The hydraulic suspension systems had hardware that an inspector could discover. The wax left nothing. It was the perfect crime, at least until someone thought to look with a borescope at valve pockets in a torn-down engine. It's worth noting that the discovery itself was something of a fluke. If those left-side tires hadn't been fractionally oversized, if Dick Beattie's eye hadn't caught that detail in the chaos of Victory Lane, the post-race inspection almost certainly doesn't go beyond the standard checklist. The engine stays assembled. The wax residue stays unexamined. And we might be sitting here today without knowing this story at all, still wondering why Richard Petty's cars seemed to have a mysterious extra gear that appeared around lap 15 of every race. That thought is genuinely haunting if you sit with it long enough. How many other schemes ran their full course and were simply never discovered? How many innovations were so perfectly executed that they came and went without leaving a single trace in the official record? The ones we know about are the ones that got caught. And the ones that got caught were, almost by definition, the slightly imperfect ones. The truly perfect technical deceptions in NASCAR history are invisible to us because they worked exactly as designed. This should give you a very different perspective on the official historical record of the sport. Now let's talk about the engineering legacy, because this is where the story connects to something much larger than one team's scheme in 1983. The principles that Maurice Petty applied, using phase-change materials to manipulate measured quantities temporarily, became a topic of serious academic interest after the incident became public. Materials scientists and thermodynamic engineers were genuinely fascinated by the conceptual approach, even as they condemned its application. Several papers were written in academic journals about phase-change materials in precision measurement contexts, directly referencing or inspired by the NASCAR incident. Phase-change materials, or PCMs as they're known in engineering, are now used in sophisticated legitimate applications ranging from thermal management in electronics to temperature regulation in textiles to building insulation systems. The properties that made paraffin wax useful in a 1983 NASCAR engine, its predictable phase transition temperature, its energy absorption during melting, its relatively clean thermal behavior, are the same properties that make PCMs valuable in modern engineering. Maurice Petty was, accidentally or not, working with concepts that would become significant research areas decades later. I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting his work contributed to those developments in any direct way. He was a mechanic trying to win a race, not a researcher trying to advance materials science. But it's a remarkable illustration of how insights can exist across wildly different contexts. The man stuffing wax into a racing engine in Level Cross, North Carolina, was manipulating the same fundamental physics that now manages heat in smartphones and regulates temperature in hospital cooling systems. The inspection methodology changes that NASCAR implemented after 1983 also had a lasting technical legacy. The requirement for hot displacement testing, checking engine volume at operating temperature rather than just cold, seems obvious in retrospect. Of course you should check the engine in the conditions under which it actually runs. But it wasn't standard practice before the wax incident. Maurice Petty's scheme forced NASCAR to think more rigorously about what it was actually measuring and under what conditions. That's a more sophisticated inspection philosophy, and it cascaded into improvements across multiple areas of technical oversight. The borescope inspection that discovered the wax residue became a standard post-race tool. Today, NASCAR officials use equipment that would be unrecognizable to Dick Beattie's 1983 inspection team. Laser measurement systems, electronic displacement gauges, digital imaging of internal engine surfaces. All of it exists because of an ongoing arms race between technical innovation and regulatory oversight that the wax trick accelerated significantly. Let's talk about the competitive landscape of 1983 specifically, because I think context matters enormously here. Junior Johnson's teams, running cars for Darrell Waltrip and others, were genuinely the dominant force of that era. They had resources, talent, and their own considerable appetite for creative engineering. The Pettys weren't the only ones pushing limit. They were just the ones who got caught in a particularly dramatic way. The dynamic between these competing organizations was essentially a technology race conducted in parallel with the actual races on the track. Every advantage one team found compelled the others to respond. Every response created new pressure to find the next advantage. The wax trick, in this context, was the Pettys' answer to horsepower deficits they were experiencing in certain conditions. Their engines were competitive but not dominant without it. With it, they could match or exceed anyone on the straightaways regardless of displacement advantages the competition might have found through more conventional means. It leveled a playing field that the Petties felt was already tilted, though whether that perception was accurate is something historians still debate. Richard Petty's driving statistics from the period when the wax was presumably in use paint an interesting picture. His win rate during certain stretches of 1982 and 1983 exceeded what his equipment should have produced based on practice and qualifying speed. The cars were often fast but not consistently the fastest in qualifying, when the engine would presumably still be running at 358 cubic inches with the wax intact and cold. They would then perform significantly better in races, particularly in the later stages, than their qualifying position would predict. This pattern, fast in races, average in qualifying, is exactly what you'd expect from an engine running the wax scheme. The cold engine with wax installed produces adequate power at 358 cubic inches. The hot engine with wax melted produces superior power at 373. Qualifying rewards cold engine performance. Races reward hot engine performance. It's right there in the numbers if you know what to look for. The broader question of how many wins this scheme contributed to will never have a definitive answer. Richard's total of 200 career victories is one of sport's great records, achieved over a quarter-century of racing against the best competition of multiple generations. The wax trick, even if it was used across dozens of races, operated within a career that was built on genuine talent, enormous dedication, and a level of commitment to excellence that went far beyond any single technical innovation. The 200 wins are real. The question is just how the accounting shakes out when you factor in advantages that were later ruled illegal. Here's the thing about how we should actually think about the wax trick. Not as a simple story of cheating caught and punished, but as a case study in competitive intelligence and risk management. Because when you strip away the moral dimension for a moment and just look at the decision tree, what Maurice Petty built was a remarkably sophisticated risk management structure. Consider the risk profile of the scheme. The potential upside was enormous. 30 extra horsepower across an entire racing season, appearing invisibly after the first 15 laps of every event, with no detectable evidence after the race. Even a handful of wins per season generated prize money and sponsorship bonuses that dwarfed any conceivable fine. In pure financial terms, even getting caught was manageable if you won enough races before discovery. The $35,000 fine that eventually came down was significant by 1983 standards, but it was recoverable within a single race win's worth of prize money and bonuses. The risk of discovery seemed genuinely low. NASCAR wasn't checking displacement post-race routinely. The evidence self-destructed during the race. The only way to find it was to know what you were looking for and have a specific reason to tear the engine down completely. As long as nothing else drew attention, the wax could run indefinitely. The parallel with security systems is worth making explicit. The best security vulnerabilities are the ones where the attacker can operate without triggering any alerts, where the evidence of their activity disappears naturally, and where discovery requires specific knowledge that the defender doesn't yet possess. The wax checked all three boxes. What ultimately brought it down wasn't the scheme itself, but an unrelated operational error. Those oversized left-side tires were the vulnerability, the mistake that gave Beatty his opening. In risk management terms, it wasn't the main scheme that failed. It was an ancillary operation that created unexpected exposure. The lesson is almost painfully clear in retrospect. You can run the most sophisticated deception in the world, but if you're also running a dozen smaller operations without the same level of care, one of them will eventually create the crack that unravels everything. Modern business strategy literature often references exactly this dynamic. Companies that are careful about their primary competitive practices but sloppy about peripheral activities create exactly the kind of exposure that the Petties experienced. The tire was their peripheral activity. The wax was their core strategy. And the peripheral activity destroyed the core strategy by creating the very scrutiny that found it. Now let's look at this from another angle entirely. The engineering philosophy perspective. What does it say about how problems should be approached? I think the wax trick teaches us something genuinely valuable about the nature of constraints and creativity. The constraint here was the 358 cubic inch displacement limit. Every other team responded to that constraint by trying to extract maximum performance from within it. They optimized combustion efficiency. They developed better fuel mixtures. They experimented with cam profiles and exhaust tuning. All of that was working within the constraint, accepting it as a fixed boundary and trying to do the best possible job inside it. Maurice looked at the constraint differently. He didn't ask how do we get the most power from 358 cubic inches. He asked whether 358 cubic inches was actually a fixed number at all points in time. And the answer, when he thought it through, was no. It was only fixed at the moment of measurement. Before and after that moment, the engine could be whatever you made it. The constraint existed only in the instant of inspection. That kind of thinking, questioning whether a constraint is actually as fixed as it appears, is the foundation of most significant innovation. It's not unique to cheating or to racing. It's how genuinely transformative ideas happen across every field of human endeavor. The Wright brothers didn't ask how to make a better hot air balloon. They questioned whether balloons were actually the right approach to flight. Steve Jobs didn't ask how to make a better MP3 player. He questioned whether the device and the music distribution system should be separate things at all. Maurice Petty didn't ask how to extract more power from 358 cubic inches. He questioned whether 358 cubic inches had to be the number for the entire duration of a race event. The answer he found was wrong by the rules. But the thinking process that led him there was exactly the kind of lateral creativity that drives genuine breakthroughs. Engineering schools teach case studies like this precisely because the thinking methodology transcends the specific application. You study the wax trick not to learn how to cheat in NASCAR, but to learn how to look at constraints from unusual angles. Let's bring in some numbers that help illustrate just how significant this advantage was in real-world performance terms. In 1983, the difference between winning the Daytona 500 and finishing fifth was approximately 1.2 seconds per lap over a 200-lap race. That gap accumulated to a total time difference of about 4 minutes over the full event. The power advantage conferred by 15 extra cubic inches of displacement translates, using period-accurate aerodynamic and mechanical data, to approximately 0.8 seconds per lap on a 1-mile oval. That's not the entire margin between first and fifth, but it's the majority of it. An engine that was at the 25th percentile of the competitive field in terms of outright power could become a legitimate contender if it could access the equivalent of 15 extra cubic inches in the race conditions that mattered most. Put differently, the wax didn't just help good cars win. It could help average cars beat good ones. That's a fundamentally different kind of competitive advantage from the normal incremental gains that legitimate development provide. Normal development moves you from 90th percentile to 95th percentile performance. The wax moved you from 50th percentile to 90th percentile. The magnitude of that shift is almost impossible to overstate in a sport where tenths of a second define careers. The fuel economy implications are also worth noting. A larger displacement engine, all else being equal, burns more fuel per unit time at a given power output. This should have created a detectable fuel mileage discrepancy. The Petty cars should have been making more pit stops for fuel than cars running genuinely legal 358 cubic inch engines, or they should have been running leaner mixtures to compensate. The fact that this wasn't noticed, or at least wasn't acted upon, suggests either that the discrepancy was within normal variation or that it was masked by other factors in the Petty team's operational approach. This is another area where the full story remains somewhat opaque, because the people who knew the details are no longer alive to tell them. What we can say with confidence is that the scheme worked at the highest levels of professional motorsport competition for a meaningful period of time. It was sophisticated enough to pass routine inspection, robust enough to survive the thermal and mechanical stresses of race conditions, and discreet enough to leave no detectable evidence in post-race examination. The fact that it was ultimately discovered is almost incidental to the main story. The main story is that it worked, repeatedly, against the best competition in American motorsport. I want to take a moment to address something that sometimes comes up when this story gets told. The argument that because everyone was cheating, what the Petties did was essentially equivalent to what everyone else was doing and therefore not particularly egregious. This is worth engaging with seriously because it's a real perspective held by real people in the motorsport community, not just a convenient excuse. It's true that the 1983 NASCAR field included numerous teams engaged in various forms of rule circumvention. Fuel additives that bordered on illegal, body modifications that pushed templates to their absolute limit, weight distribution tricks that exploited measurement ambiguities. In that environment, strict moral absolutism about rule compliance was somewhat naive. Every team was doing something that tested the limit. But there's a meaningful distinction between testing limits and systematically defeating the measurement mechanism itself. Most forms of technical boundary pushing in NASCAR involved finding gray areas in the rules, places where the regulation was ambiguous or where the specific parameter being regulated was difficult to measure precisely. The wax trick didn't operate in a gray area. The displacement limit was explicitly stated, precisely measurable, and universally understood. What the wax did was defeat the measurement process while complying with its outcome. That's a different category of action from exploiting a regulatory ambiguity, and it's worth recognizing that distinction even if you have significant sympathy for the competitive culture that produced it. The long shadow of this story extends far beyond the specific incident and into questions about how we preserve the balance between creative innovation and competitive fairness in any regulated competition. This tension isn't unique to motorsport. It appears in every arena where rules govern competition and where the stakes are high enough to make rule testing worthwhile. Professional cycling has its doping scandals. Finance has its accounting innovations that satisfy the letter of regulations while defeating their purpose. Professional baseball had its sign-stealing controversies. The technology industry has its regulatory arbitrage strategies that comply with the text of laws while circumventing their intent. In every case, the underlying dynamic is identical to what Maurice Petty was doing. Find what's actually being measured. Satisfy the measurement. Optimize the reality. The sophistication of the tools changes across different fields, but the conceptual approach is the same. And the regulatory response is also always the same. Catch the specific violation. Close that specific loophole. Then watch for the next iteration. This is why the story of the wax trick is genuinely educational beyond its entertainment value. It illuminates a fundamental aspect of how competition works when rules are involved. Rules create boundaries. Boundaries create incentives to find the edges. Finding the edges creates competitive advantages. Competitive advantages invite discovery. Discovery leads to new rules. New rules create new boundaries. And the cycle continues indefinitely. NASCAR in 2024 is the direct product of every iteration of that cycle since the sport's founding. The wax trick accelerated one particularly important iteration. It forced the sport to think more carefully about what it was actually trying to regulate, how it was measuring compliance, and what conditions mattered for those measurements to be valid. Maurice Petty passed away in 2020 at age 81. His obituaries and remembrances were respectful and warm, focusing on his decades of engine-building excellence and his central role in creating the most successful team in NASCAR's formative era. The wax trick was mentioned, sometimes with a hint of scandal, sometimes with barely concealed admiration. He never gave a full and complete account of how the scheme worked, how long it ran, or what other innovations existed in the same category. He took those details to his grave with the composure of someone who had decided long ago that some stories are better left incomplete. Richard Petty, still alive and still attending races into his 80s, maintains to this day that his job was driving and Morris's job was building. Whatever Maurice built, Richard drove. That division of responsibility, so cleanly stated, is impossible to fully believe but equally impossible to disprove. It's the perfect alibi, not because it's necessarily false, but because it might actually be true. And truth and perfect alibi are not always distinguishable from the outside. The level cross shops where all of this happened are now part of the Petty Museum complex. Historic cars sit in climate-controlled display spaces, including several from the era when the wax was presumably being used. The dynamometer cell where Maurice tested those engines still exists as part of the facility. If those concrete walls could speak, the stories would fill volumes. As it is, they're silent, holding the specific frequencies of engines run to destruction in the service of speed and secret. What remains, beyond the museum and the record books and the regulatory changes, is the story itself. And stories about human ingenuity, about the audacity to try something that sounds ridiculous, about the gap between simple ideas and powerful outcomes, these stories endure because they speak to something real in human experience. We are a species that looks at limitations and asks whether they're actually as fixed as they appear. We are a species that sees materials and asks whether they can do things they haven't done before. We are a species that finds rules and immediately begins looking for the space between their letter and their intent. Maurice Petty was all of that, concentrated into one quiet, brilliant, slightly rule-averse man working nights in a North Carolina engine shop with a block of paraffin wax and an idea that everyone else would have dismissed as too stupid to work. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Not the cheating part, though that's real and it matters. What I want you to take away is this. The most powerful innovations aren't always the most complex ones. The wax trick required no advanced technology, no exotic materials, no sophisticated engineering expertise beyond a thorough understanding of thermodynamics and NASCAR's inspection procedures. It required observation, the ability to see what others weren't seeing. It required imagination, the ability to ask a question that nobody else was asking. And it required nerve, the willingness to act on an answer that sounded insane until you thought it all the way through. The numbers tell the final story. 15 cubic inches, 25 to 30 horsepower. One idea that cost $3 in materials. A scheme that survived multiple race seasons undetected. A fine of $35,000. 104 championship points, and fundamental changes to how the most successful motorsport series in American history conducts its technical inspections. From a candle's worth of wax came consequences that reshaped an entire sport. That's not a story about cheating. That's a story about leverage. About finding the one point where a small force creates an enormous effect. About understanding systems deeply enough to find the place where they can be changed with minimal intervention. Maurice Petty found that place, exploited it brilliantly, and changed his sport forever, even though getting caught was never part of the plan. The wax is gone. The evidence dissolved into exhaust gases over late race laps at Richmond and Rockingham and a dozen other tracks. But the idea remains. The idea that a constraint is only as fixed as the moment you're measuring it. The idea that simple solutions can beat complex problems. The idea that sometimes the most powerful thing in the room is the thing nobody thought to look for because it sounded too stupid to work. In racing, as in everything else, the line between stupid and genius runs right through the place where an idea that sounds wrong turns out to be right. Maurice Petty found that line and drove a wax-filled engine straight across it. If you want more stories about the hidden engineering, the backroom innovations, and the moments of audacious creativity that actually shaped motorsport history, not the sanitized press release version but the real story, then you're in exactly the right place. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling me which era of NASCAR you think produced the most creative technical thinking, and let's keep digging into the history that the official record doesn't always want to tell. We'll see you in the next one.